where does misbehavior come from? There's a number of different reasons, and this is a very, very controversial topic in general, right? So what is effective behavior management? You'll see down here in the second section, controversial in nature, right? But really, we could even put it up here too. Where does it come from? Sometimes people will swear, right? They'll get on their hands and knees and swear to you by all the divines. They're like, oh no, it is just a product of their environment. Man, those underprivileged backgrounds cause people to be psychopaths and sociopaths. And, that's just, look, if they were in a better situation, they wouldn't act that way, right? And it's like, yeah, no, that's just not true, right? Is that part of it? Yeah, that's part of it. Are you kidding me? Of course that's part of it, right? But there's a number of different factors influencing misbehavior. And if you think otherwise, that just means you don't know what you're talking about. People, this is very, hits the heart, right? People will swear up and down, and their ideologies politically are going to reflect what they feel about behavior management and where it comes from, and what is effective behavior management and what it should look like. So you have to take that into consideration. There's not necessarily one right answer. Usually it's a mix of answers, but people are going to be very, very divided on one side or the other. So you got to be careful about who you're talking to about these things, and coming to very, very carefully constructed opinions about them. So you don't want to just jump into anything. So the first thing here is poor socialization. Where does misbehavior come from? Poor socialization. But we're not ignoring anything else, right? We're not ignoring lack of understanding, negative influences, lack of structure, underprivileged backgrounds, personality differences, right? We are simply saying, look, that is just one element of misbehavior and where it comes from, right? So poor socialization, right? What is socialization? What is antisocial behavior? You're going to hear that as a synonym for misbehavior throughout my lecture here. What is antisocial behavior? What is antisocial tendencies? It's the same thing, right? Misbehavior, antisocial tendencies, same thing, all of that. So poor socialization would simply be the fostering of antisocial behaviors, right? And antisocial behaviors are you're not acting in accordance with societal norms and expectations, right? That's basically what antisocial behavior is. It's going against the grain, usually in a negative manner, right? So, so that's antisocial, right? You're behaving against the majority. Or what the majority should look like in an ideal society where, we have laws, we have rules, we have regulations for things. And if you're not abiding by those, or those expectations in terms of how you should act as a proper adult or human being who's respectable to others, that's going to be poor socialization. So where does poor socialization come from, though? That's probably one thing that you're asking yourselves in your head. And, it's a very, very interesting topic. When I was a teacher, I was always coming in under the presumption that antisocial behavior was caused simply by underprivileged backgrounds and, parents who are just, antisocial themselves. And that's partially true, right? Or negative influences, right? So at a young age. But I figured it could be any age. I figured that, look, you can change somebody's antisocial tendencies, by the time they're like 30, and say, well, look, we've done all we can to sort of reteach you and re-educate you, and now you're going to be a pro-social, so the good socialization, pro-social member of society. Well, it turns out that's actually not the case. And so antisocial behavior is almost impossible to eradicate from children by the time they're leaving kindergarten, right? And you think to yourself, no, that's not true. It's like you just take a kid and you give them the right advice and guidance, and it's like now you've changed their personalities completely, right? And now they are respectable members of society. And it doesn't matter if they're 7 years old now, right? In the second grade, they're going to be respectable members of society, and they're not going to break any rules, and they're not going to give you any grief, and they're not going to hit other kids, and they're not going to throw stuff throughout your classroom. It's like, no, that's not the case. And so one of the reasons why preschool is most important is because it gets kids established with rules and learning how to interact and play with one another. And that's one of the things that school likes to foster, but by the time we start to foster it, it's oftentimes too late. So the parental influence on poor socialization is extremely big. So by the time they come to you as a teacher, it's oftentimes too late, unless you're one of the younger teachers, like preschool or kindergarten. And so how do you get poorly socialized? Well, you can think of the world through the lens of games, right? everybody is always interacting with one another, and you can think of it as like a miniature game in some regards. Even little conversations are like a miniature game. And games have rules. Games have structure. And if you don't have rules, then you don't have games. Football has rules. Soccer has rules, right? Baseball has rules. Basketball has rules. Chess has rules. Checkers has rules, right? And if you break those rules throughout that game, whatever the game that might be, that would be antisocial behavior, because you're not abiding by the expectations that have been placed upon you in that structure of that game, right? Now, kids who are poorly socialized and they come to you by the age of, like, let's say 5 or 6, right? Those kids are, if they weren't brought up with structure and rules and meaningful consequences for those violations, flagrant violations, then you're going to have kids who grow up to be antisocial. Look, like if a little kid's swearing at home and the parent finds it hilarious and they just swear all the time from like age 3 all the way till they get to like age 5 or 6 and they go to kindergarten, it's like, yeah, they're going to be antisocial, and there's really nothing you can do to wire it out of their heads in some regards, right? And you think that you can, right? But it's more of like a natural tendency, right? I don't believe in free will. I don't think there's any evidence for free will. And people, they tend to just be rooted in some regards by their environmental influences, right? And so an environmental influence could be something like parents teaching kids how to swear, or parents who are playing with their kids, right? And their kids start to just like punch and kick and whatnot. Or maybe they take their kid to the playground, they just sit on their phone, and now their kid's interacting with the other kids, and that kid just walks up and starts hitting the other kids and beating them up and whatnot. And look, that's poor socialization. They're getting reinforced that behavior is okay. And so oftentimes socialization comes through play, right? And especially when you're a young kid, that's all you really should be doing is playing. And if you're not playing, right, that's negatively impactful. And if you're not playing with rules, then nobody wants to be your friend. And if nobody wants to be your friend, then you're not going to be able to play at all in the future, right? And the only people left for you to play with are the other kids who are also antisocial, where there's a much greater lack of rules. And so one thing that you'll notice when you're dealing with behavior, and I think this is right. I watched the lecture from Jordan Peterson where I found this stuff out. And now I don't necessarily agree with him politically, but the dude was a Harvard psychologist, right? Like go ahead and argue with that, right? And so anyways, one of the reasons I think that this has to be the case, and it is rooted in play, and I think this is 100% correct, is because you'll notice when you get into the classroom and you are a teacher, that kids, they're not necessarily doing things because they want to be evil, so little Timmy walks up to little Jimmy and he punches him in the face, right? And I mean that. I'm not just saying that, right? And not like he just punches him in the face just because, right? Or he'll just, shove him down the steps, right? They're not doing it because, they're trying to be evil, right? Now, you could argue that behavior is evil, yeah, right? But they're not doing it to be evil. They're doing it because they're attempting to engage in play, but they have no idea how to in the least, right? And so, look, poor socialization, it starts with play. And if they're not interacting properly with rules and expectations, from the get-go, when they're very little, it's very hard to work that out of kids. And so I was watching this discussion with this antisocial personality researcher by the name of, I think it was Richard Tremblay. And he's one of the people who worked with, I think it was Joanne McCord. And they focused a lot on antisocial behavior and how you can mitigate that in children. And one of the things that they found was if you take kids who are, I think, in like the 1st or 2nd grade, and which by that time it's already too late, right? But if you take them in that 1st or 2nd grade and you do the absolute most, right? So you take that one antisocial kid and you surround him with all pro-social kids, right? So everybody's really pro-social. And you just teach rules and expectations, with them and how to socially interact, right, with one another and etiquette, then, they tend to have more pro-social friends by the time they reach adulthood if you do like a follow-up study, so like a longitudinal study. Now, that would be evidence of more pro-social behavior in the child. Now, the thing is, it's like you have to really be all in, right? But the problem is you can't be all in all the time, right? Because eventually the kids sort of segregate themselves in terms of their sociability, right? So the quote-unquote bad kids are going to hang out with the bad kids, right? The pro-social kids are going to hang out with the other pro-social kids. And there will be a mix between them both, right? But generally speaking, they will segregate themselves to kids who are just like them in terms of sociability. And I think that tends to be the case. So there's a lot of overlap, right? They won't totally segregate themselves, right? But they're not going to, like for example, like if you're playing a game with somebody who always wants to hit you and whatnot, you're not going to want to be around them, right? Because you're pro-social and they're antisocial, right? And so, because they don't know, they're not even doing it to be mean. That's just how they interact with one another. Nobody ever told them that wasn't okay, right? When they were little, and it's ingrained in their head now. So poor socialization, that's one very, very important thing for education. That's one of the places it comes from. Next up, lack of understanding. So if a kid is in class and they don't understand what the content is that is being taught, then they're just, straight up, they're just not going to give much effort forth, right? And if they're not understanding things in any capacity, why should they try, right? So you're going to have kids all the time, right? Like you think you're in middle school, right? You're a middle school teacher and you're not going to have kids on a kindergarten level. It's like, think again, right? Because you're going to have lots of kids like that. And those kids aren't going to understand the content, so they're just going to mess around, right? Because there's no point in them trying on 8th grade content if they're at kindergarten level, right? They will never understand it, ever, right? And even if they can understand it somewhat conceptually, just in terms of like hearing things, let's say you have a writing prompt, for example, they can't write it at 8th grade level, so they'll just fail every single time. And so, if they got a lack of understanding, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to, start to behave, right? Because they're just going to get distracted with things. Right, and that's going to tie into a lack of structure here that we'll talk about in a second, but the next thing would be negative influences, right? So there was this researcher here, again, this is pulling on from that lecture that I was talking about with Jordan Peterson, and he was saying that there's this one study, it's a very foundational, seminal work, and it was this study on Somerville, and you take this, you take a bunch of kids who are in a rough situation, they're antisocial, they've been identified on like a pre-track for criminality, and you say, all right, we're going to do all we possibly can, right, to intervene and try to mitigate this antisocial behavior, right? So then, you're giving them tutoring, right, maybe a ride to and from school or something, you're helping out the parents a little bit, you're just doing all that you possibly can to help these kids, right? And then you say, all right, well, in addition to that, we're going to take these kids and for a couple weeks out of the year, we're going to send them to a summer camp and they're going to, be allowed to play with one another. And so all the antisocial kids are there together and they're going to play with one another. And, hopefully we'll see what the results were. Were they more pro-social now? Well, it turns out after those couple weeks of the kids being together, when they ran the data analysis in terms of sociability, the kids who were less antisocial ended up becoming even more antisocial, right? And so that's one of the things you can think about with prison, right? You have a bunch of antisocial people together, it's probably the worst possible thing. The people who were less antisocial just become more antisocial, and it doesn't work the other way around, right? And so if you're in the classroom and you're trying to organize your class with groups and whatnot, the worst thing you can possibly do is place the kids who are the best pro-social kids with the most antisocial kids, right? Because they're just going to make the kids who are pro-social even more antisocial. It does not work the other way around, so don't think it works the other way around. So negative influence is huge, right? And so you're going to have kids, the most antisocial kids are always going to be prodding those who are more pro-social to do their bidding or to engage with them and interact with them, right? Because, they might not necessarily care about school at all, right? And so they're just, there to have fun, have a good time. It's like a little vacation for them, right? You need to come to school, you get to talk with your friends, you get to hang out all day, you get to have some good lunch, right? I mean, it's like a vacation home for them, right? It's like a spa, it's like a resort. And so why on earth would they want to, do work, especially if they're going to get passed on to the next grade anyways, right? And so one thing that you'll find out is that you can't always hold kids back, right? It's not how it used to be, right? Kids can be held back only a couple times nowadays and just get passed on forever. And I really mean that. They could have 0%, right, for 5 years straight and still pass on to the next grade. And they could literally never pick up a pencil once their entire time. They'll still move on to the next grade. So it's, it's very rough, right? The negative influence is a big problem. And, that's going to be one of the causes of this, misbehavior, right? If you had a whole class of pro-social kids, you put one antisocial kid there, it's the pro-social kids might become a little bit more antisocial, right? But generally speaking, you're going to get a lot more stuff done, right? Because there's less negative influences there for people to mess around or people to bite into it. So next up here, we got lack of structure. So as a teacher, you should always be trying to fill your time, right? Never have any downtime. Downtime is your enemy, right? You don't want to have time where the kids can just do whatever they want, because then they're going to start to freak out once they do whatever they want, right? They're not going to do things that you would deem desirable. They're just going to start messing around and doing crazy things. And so you always want to have structure, have a lot of routine, right? It's like every day we walk in this classroom, we're going to silence ourselves before we walk in. We're going to sit down nice and respectfully, right? Then we're going to do our bell work, right? There's no talking during this, right? And then we proceed with class and we can have a fun time. But we got to collect ourselves first, right? And so, lots of structure all the time, right? They should have a nice routine. They should be expected to know what they have to do. And, structure is also times going to come with expectations for your class. Do you have any classroom rules? If you don't have classroom rules, I mean, God, you're already missing out, right? You want to have a lot of rules and a lot of expectations that you quite frankly you want to see fostered in your classroom, right? And that goes with the socialization, right? You're doing all you possibly can to redeem any little scrap of hope that you can make these kids more pro-social, right? And so there are going to be rules, and they can't violate these rules. They can't transgress upon them, and you want them to exhibit these expectations all the time. So, for example, what would be a good rule? No profanity in class or making fun of other students, right? Always remain seated facing toward the board, and never move your desk away from the assigned area without permission. Never emotionally or physically hurt another student. Always remain silent unless instructed otherwise, and that way you're ready to learn and grow. And so, just lots of little rules, expectations, things that you want to see. And you want to apply those things equitably, too. And so that could be another thing that we'll talk about here in terms of what are some strategies and tools to help you with behavior management. If you're not applying things equitably, why should kids care about your rules, right? So if you're only picking on one kid for doing a rule, but everybody else is breaking the rules, right, that one kid's not going to care, right? And so you got to apply it equitably, apply it to everybody, right? So lack of structure, underprivileged backgrounds. It's like you have absolutely no idea, right, some of the backgrounds that these kids have, and maybe you do, and I hope that you don't, because it's extremely, and I hope that you do, right? So you take into consideration, but I will say it's a horrible experience, right? It makes you very, very sad, very depressed when you have to think about their lives and the situations that they have come from, because, well, quite frankly, it's very bad oftentimes, right? Especially in a lot of these inner city, very poor districts. It's extremely poor lifestyles. And, I can think of many situations. There was this one situation where we had, well, I don't even know if I can really say, but we had this one kid, and his parents treated him absolutely miserably, like a Harry Potter type situation, like just horrible, abused, treated him like a dog, right? He was just like property almost, right? It wasn't even like a human being, basically, to these parents, right? And he comes to school, the kid's a nervous wreck, right? The kid has, he has really hard times getting bullied, right? He's, he just can't interact properly, right? Because he gets upset with something, he just freaks out, right? And it's almost like a defense mechanism in some regards, right? But, look, these are things that are going to sort of be ingrained in some of your kids, right? As a consequence of these underprivileged backgrounds, right? So underprivileged would be like, look, maybe you don't got the best parents, right? And then maybe poverty, for example. Maybe, look, you're constantly hungry all the time, and if you're hungry, then you don't have enough food on the table, and food is great for developing kids in terms of their, in terms of nurturing kids for their developmental growth. And so if they're not going to have enough food, right, that's going to be one thing that plays into the role. Money is going to be another thing. Maybe kids are getting bullied for dressing a certain way, or not driving a car to school or walking or something. Just little things. It really depends on where you're at. If you're at an uppity district, or if you're at a poorer district, or wherever. But underprivileged backgrounds, it's very very sad to see nowadays, but schools are around the world are doing a little bit better at it. The United States is always lacking, of course, but underprivileged backgrounds, these are helping to be mitigated a little bit as time progresses throughout the globe, usually in the Nordic countries as well as Western Europe. So that's pretty good. But underprivileged backgrounds, very, very sad, very depressing. Poverty, right? Homelessness, right? Like, look, dude, like if you're homeless, right? Like I had a kid who was living out of a hotel, And he would straight up tell me, he'd be like, look, I'm going to go home and I'm going to smoke weed over the weekend with my friends. Or he'd be like, I'm going to, he's like, yeah, just do it. He'd just tell me crazy things, right? And, you find out he's living out of a hotel room, right? His parents aren't really there for him. He has like no structure in the least, right? And then this, you got this poor kid here, and it's like, look, if you're homeless, man, and you don't know where you're going to be staying the next day, it's like the last thing you care about is learning about like minerals or something, right? It's like, why should you learn about minerals when you don't even have a house, right? I mean, just think about it, right? I mean, it's no different than it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Shelter is going to be one of the biggest needs, and then we can learn about minerals later on, right, in our career once we become a little bit more comfortable. So underprivileged backgrounds, very huge, very important. And then we got our personality differences. So one of the things that I study in particular is personality differences between different people. And I sort of look at the world through the lens of personality. And personality is about 80% heritable by the time people have reached their senior years. And heritable means that they were essentially born that way. And but having said that, if you're just like a young adult, maybe your personality is 50% heritable, and maybe it's 50% environmental, right? And so that means that about half of somebody's personality is a consequence of their environment, right? If it's 50-50. Now, right, that's only half, right? And the best way to conceptualize this here, it's like not everybody's always a product of their environment, right? The poor socialization is a product of environment most oftentimes, unless you got like a psychopath. That's one of the differences between psychopaths and sociopaths is sociopaths are sort of made, psychopaths are born, right? And so they're just antisocial, from nature with their, I believe it's like their sympathetic nervous system just doesn't react the same way to certain situations like other people do. They're more numb to things. But personality differences, right? If you're born like an extrovert, for instance, right? Because we all know what extroversion is, right? You can make somebody act like an introvert, right, or exhibit those qualities, or vice versa, the other way around. You can make an introvert act like an extrovert, but the chances that they're going to like that is like 0, right? And so you can do it, but they're not going to enjoy it. And so these personality differences are rooted, they're embedded in us, right, from birth, right, as well as our environment. And the reason it's like 50-50 by the time when they're like teenagers is because they don't have complete control over their environment yet. Their parents are dictating things that they have to do one way or the other. And so the qualities that they exhibit, and their teachers are, and their administrators, and so the qualities that they exhibit are not necessarily completely on their own accord. Whereas by the time you're a senior and you're like 75 years old, it's like, it's 80% heritable because you completely control your life, right? Nobody can tell you anything, and if they try to tell you something, you just simply do not care enough, right, to follow whatever they have to try to impress upon you. So personality difference is another thing. Some people have more antisocial personalities than other people do, and it's just one of those things that you could be born with, for instance, right? So maybe somebody's very disagreeable, right? There's a personality trait called agreeableness on the 5-factor personality model, which is the most popular model used for personality, and it appears to be right in my estimation. And agreeableness. So let's say you have a person who is telling somebody rules, right? And you got an agreeable person and you have a disagreeable person. The person who's agreeable will pretty much always follow the rules, right? Whereas the person who's disagreeable, they're going to combat you every step along the way, right? Because they don't want to follow those rules. They want to do their own thing. Right now, maybe they agree with you, and then maybe they will follow that rule. But if they don't, they're going to tell you, right? They're going to be very confrontational with you. They're going to have some conflict. And so on personality differences, that's one thing. So poor socialization. Again, these kids, they're not being brought up with rules and expectations. Nobody teaching them how to act properly. And these things sort of get embedded in them through their most developmental years, from like 1 to like maybe 5 or 6, right? And after 1, like say like 1 to 5, right, or like 0 to 5, these kids, they can sort of get stuck in these like tracks of sociability, right? And it's very unfortunate. And again, they get stuck because all their peers are going to have to interact with them. And like again, the pro-social kids oftentimes are going to interact with pro-social kids. Antisocial kids are going to interact with other antisocial kids. And there will be a bunch of mix in the middle, mix between groups. But generally speaking, they're going to segregate themselves a little bit. So generally speaking, everybody will be very similar. But the line between antisocial behavior that leads to criminality and doesn't it's pretty thin, right? And so you can hop back and forth pretty easily. And so even if you're close, just being 10% more pro-social can go a long way. And those small differences manifest themselves at the extremes. And so poor socialization is huge. Ideally, you want to get as much early childhood education as possible. So preschool, you're always working with your kid, teaching them common decency and etiquette. And then you want to foster that as much as you can throughout their school year, so always be involved.